So we start with quadrilateral, and then we go to two parallel lines, which we're going to learn about today, but this is called trapezoid. And you take a trapezoid and you make it so there are two congruent sides. That's called an isosceles trapezoid. And then we got two pairs of parallel lines is a parallelogram. We got a rhombus when it's all sides congruent, and a rectangle when it's all angles, right angles. You combine those together, you get a square. And then a quadrilateral without any parallel sides is called a kite. So a kite looks like this. It has two sets of congruent sides that are next to each other. So consecutive sides means next to each other or in a row. Opposite sides would be across from each other. And we don't have that in a kite. We don't have congruent opposite sides like we do in like a parallelogram. We call the angles that are in between the congruent sides vertex angles, and then the other angles non-vertex angles. These are the kite properties. So two pairs of consecutive sides congruent. These are congruent to each other, and these are congruent to each other. Then we have non-vertex angles are congruent. One diagonal bisects the vertex angles. So this is congruent to this. And it also bisects the other diagonal. And then the diagonals are perpendicular. A trapezoid is a shape that has two bases that are parallel to each other, and we call the other sides that are not parallel to each other legs. Let's go through some of this vocabulary. So the bases are the parallel sides. There's two of them. The leg is the non-parallel sides. The base angles are the ones that are touching or adjacent to the bases. And then the height is the distance between the bases. And it makes a right angle. And it's meaning it's perpendicular to the bases. So this right here is the height. It is perpendicular to both bases. And then an isosceles trapezoid is a trapezoid with congruent legs. So if you look up here, this one is an isosceles because the legs are congruent. Whereas this first one is just a regular trapezoid because the legs are not congruent. So a trapezoid has one pair of opposite sides parallel. That's the definition and the only property. So those represent the parallel, and then if it's turned on its side, those would be parallel. Then the properties of an isosceles trapezoid are that the non-parallel sides are congruent. So from a trapezoid, the bases are parallel. So we'll just do that for all of them. Right now, they're only trapezoids, but we have to add these extra ones to make it an isosceles trapezoid. So the non-parallel sides are congruent. Base angles are congruent. And the diagonals are congruent. Now this is a little tricky. So we want to show the diagonals are congruent, but they're not bisected. So you need to have the same amount of tick marks total along the diagonal. So if I put 1 mark here and 2 marks here, and then I put 1 mark here and 2 marks here, they both have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 tick marks. So they're congruent. But since I have a different amount on each part where they intersect, that is because the diagonals do not bisect each other like they would in a parallelogram. Right. We have one set of parallel sides, that's a trapezoid. One diagonal perpendicular bisects the other diagonal, that's a kite. Two sets of base angles congruent, that's an isosceles trapezoid. And then two sets of consecutive sides congruent, that's a kite. Now we have multiple properties. So we're going to name the red property, then the purple, and then put it all together for the most specific quadrilateral for the entire, both properties put together. So property 1 is consecutive sides congruent, and that's a property from a kite. Property 2 is you have perpendicular diagonals, and that could be a kite or a rhombus. But our final answer is a kite because in order to be a rhombus, we would also need to have all sides congruent. Okay, number 6, property 1. So this is the diagonals are congruent, but they're not bisected. So then it can't be a rectangle. If it were a rectangle, then all 4 sections would have to be the same. So that is a property of an isosceles trapezoid. And then we have one set of parallel. And that's a property of a trapezoid. You put together an isosceles trapezoid with a trapezoid, you get an isosceles trapezoid. Okay, the final one. Property 1 is diagonals bisect each other. And that's a property of a parallelogram. Property 2, two sets of parallel sides. That's a property of a parallelogram. Therefore, we have a parallelogram. So the difference between the last 2 problems is that they look similar, but in problem number 6, we only have one set of parallel sides, whereas in problem number 7, we have 2 sets. And then problem number 6, the diagonals are congruent but do not bisect each other. And in the last one, they bisect each other but are not congruent.